Hey guys, and welcome to another tutorial in Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020 in the Microsoft Airbus A320 Neo. We are using the latest fly-by-wire mod, which is at the moment 0.4.0, and today's tutorial we're going to have a look at Rnav approaches, or area navigation approaches, as I've been asked a little bit about those and how they differ from normal ILS approaches. So let's jump into the cockpit and let's take a look. So we're currently at Naples Airport, runway 24, and the plan is we're just going to fly the Rnav approach for the same runway, Rnav 24 Yankee. If you have a Navigraph subscription or you've got access to the Jefferson charts, then that is the chart that you will need for this tutorial. So it's the Rnav Yankee for runway 24 at Naples, Lima, India, Romeo, November. It's also sometimes displayed on the chart not as an Rnav approach but as an RNP approach, and they're essentially the same thing. So let's just have a quick look at the McDo. As you can see, there's the destination we're leaving from, and it's also the destination we're arriving to. And what I'm going to do is we're going to go in here and we're going to select the runway 24, not the ILS, but instead the Rnav Yankee approach, which is just here. And the Rnav Yankee approach begins at a waypoint called Unpop, or however you want to pronounce that, Unpoop. So we'll just insert that just there. There we go. So as we have a quick look up here, we can see that our first waypoint is already there and displayed on the navigation display. Alright, so what's first is we'll get up into the air, and I'm going to try and do this without displaying the charts. Even though I do have them next to me on the tablet, I am aware that many of you watching this will not have a Navigraph subscription or the charts. If you have, great, because you can follow it along, but I am going to do this without the charts, and that is certainly possible. So when you're making an Rnav approach, an area navigation approach, what's more important is the altitude constraints that you have listed. Now you don't need the charts to see those, because you can turn these on by clicking just here. And if we go down here as well, you can also see that you've got altitude constraints here. So at Unpop we need to be 8,000 feet, at RN513 4,000 feet, RN512 2,400 feet. You get the idea as we scroll down. And the important one here is this last one. This is the last waypoint on the Rnav approach, and the altitude is 1,900 feet. So that is our last waypoint. That will become important as we go along. Now normally there are two different ways that we can fly an Rnav approach. There's a fully managed, or there's the other way, where we use the flight path angle. Now I'd love to cover that in more detail, but unfortunately Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020 we can't, as the track button here is in-op and doesn't work. So for the time being, our Rnav approaches will be what's called fully managed approaches, which is very, very similar to ILS approaches. So let's take off, and things will become a little bit more clear once we get going. So first of all, I said that our initial altitude for the start of the approach was 8,000 feet, so we may as well set that to 8,000 feet, and let's get going. I also want to, just as we take off, you can see that if I zoom out on the plan, that's going to be our Rnav approach, but I just want to, instead of flying that straight away, let's just select the heading mode so that we take off and continue to fly straight for the time being. Okay, so let's get into the air. Here we go. Oh, parking brakes. Let's release those. You tend to go further without the parking brakes on. Okay, so we'll just toga thrust for today's demonstration. 100 knots. And rotate. Positive rate of climb, gear up. Unarm the ground spoilers and retract the slats and flaps. Okay, so let's pop the autopilot on, so that will maintain our runway heading for the time being, and it should continue our climb up to 8,000 feet. I'm just going to reduce the thruster. Oh, I always forget to turn that off when doing these tutorials. What a pain. Okay, so we've set a climb thrust, and I'm now just going to make a left bank to start heading towards that initial approach fix of Unpop. So, if you're not familiar with area navigation approaches, they may seem a little bit daunting, but I can guarantee you they're not. If you're given the choice between an Rnav approach and an ILS approach, obviously the easy option and the more stable option is the ILS approach. So area navigation, Rnav approaches, depend upon the aircraft's own GPS system, which is good because sometimes if in the real world you're flying and some waypoints such as VORs or even ILS beacons, they can be out of use for maintenance or something like that, whereas area navigation depends solely upon the aircraft's own GPS system. So we've got our altitude constraints on here because that means we'll also get to display them on the navigation display, which is what we want. So getting the aircraft up to 8,000 feet, and you can see that actually, because our first waypoint in this very short flight plan is Unpop, then 8,000 feet here would normally be blue after taking off, but it's actually in purple, which tells us that that's a constraint, which it is. We need to be at 8,000 feet by Unpop. So if we just zoom out a little bit, so let's make a left turn as we start to work our way towards Unpop, and then once we're on track for that, I will enter managed mode, which will then effectively follow the green line all the way down to the runway, and all we have to do is manage the altitude. Now it's a little bit more complicated in the real world, because if you've got the Navigraph charts, what you have to do is on here in the real McDo, it gives you the vector headings from waypoint to waypoint. You need to make sure that all of those line up absolutely perfectly with the charts that you've got, to make sure there's no room for error. But we can't do that in Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020 yet, as it's not quite that detailed. So this is basically how to fly an Rnav approach in Flight Sim 2020 as it stands. Okay, so we're turning towards Unpop now, and this would be if you were flying into Naples from somewhere else and you're making this Rnav approach. This would be your first waypoint coming in here. We're actually very, very heavy. I should have reduced the fuel before taking off. I could do it now in flight, but that's not very realistic. Is there a fuel dump button? I could just dump it out over the sea. Okay, so let's bring our heading around. So what we're going to do essentially is, when we get close to this first waypoint of Unpop, we are going to select our altitude to our final constraint height, which is 1,900 feet. And what the aircraft should do is you can see other constraints just here now displayed, which match up with what we saw down here. So we'll be at 8,000 feet by unpop, and I'm going to select to descend to 1,900 feet. It will not cross 4,000 feet until it gets to this waypoint here, and it will not cross 2,400, is that? Yeah, 2,400 feet by that waypoint there. And I've got the charts next to me, and that actually matches up perfectly. Okay, so I'm now going to enter managed mode, and the aircraft will start to bank towards this first waypoint. Now again, I've got the charts here, so our minimum descent altitude for this procedure is 690 feet, so I'm just going to go to the approach phase down here and just enter some detail in. So QNH 1013, and our minimum descent altitude is 690, and again you do need the Navigraph charts to get that. Okay, so we're coming up now on unpop, and I'm going to select our altitude to 1,900 feet and engage that. And you'll see that it hasn't moved. We have not started the descent, and if you look down here you can see that that final altitude is just there, 1,900 feet. That is actually incorrect. That shouldn't happen. What should happen is the next constraint should be displayed just there, which is go back here, which is 4,000 feet. So just there it's showing the altitude that I've selected, but in real terms it should say 4,000 feet just there, because even though we want to go to 1,900 feet, we can't just yet. But if you look now, we're now on to the next waypoint, Romeo November 513, and the descent has started. So I'm also going to enter the approach phase now, activate that, which will reduce our speed. I should have perhaps entered the approach mode a little sooner before coming up on unpop, but there we go. It means we might just have to make a rather rapid descent down to hit 4,000 feet. We'll see how the aircraft manages that. Okay, so what we are going to do, unlike an ILS approach where as you're turning to line up with the ILS and you sort of intercept that ILS beam, as you're waiting to intercept the ILS beam, you would arm the approach mode and turn that on. We're not going to do that with an Rnav approach. What we are going to do is wait until we are headed towards our final waypoint before the runway, which is this RN511. So basically, once we've passed RN512 and headed towards 511, that's when we'll turn on the APPR mode. Now, as well with this, you do not need to turn on the landing system, because that is for the ILS information, which we do not have. We're not using an ILS approach for this. So just watching now, we're descending 1,800 feet per minute, headed towards this waypoint here, where the constraint is 4,000, so we should not be allowed to go below 4,000 feet at this waypoint. Now it's just triggered onto the next waypoint, RN512. So the next altitude constraint is 2,400 feet. What is also very, very important if you're flying in terms of live weather is you must have the QNH correct from the airport that you're from air traffic control that you're flying into. That is very, very important, as it uses the altitude to guide its way down to the runway. Now the descent rate for this approach is 3.3 degrees, which using the other method of this Rnav approach you would be able to use and set here, but we can't do that, so we're now turning onto this final approach. So I'm going to start bringing out the flaps, and if you look, it's just held us a little bit, and now it started that descent to 1,900 feet. We'll arm the flaps again. Okay, so now we are headed towards that final fix. I'm going to turn on the approach phase, and you can see that the final approach has been armed just there. It's calling sync rate then for some reason. I will pop the gear down. And full flaps as well. Now what you should get here, first of all, there are a couple of things incorrect. So it says Cat 3 single. That wouldn't be displayed on an Rnav approach because that's for ILS information. What you should also see here are purple, not diamonds like you would on an ILS, but you should have a vertical and horizontal guidance system coming just here. Now I have found actually if you do turn on the ILS info, which I told you not to turn on earlier, see how there is a purple brick rather than a purple magenta diamond? Well, that is effectively telling us that we are on the correct descent path. That should have come up automatically with the Rnav approach and the approach mode armed. You shouldn't need to turn on this, and actually strangely enough if I turn it off it now remains, so there's a handy little bug for you to know about. Okay, so we're at 1,000 feet. I'm just going to reduce the speed a little bit, give the cabin a ding, and there you can see the airport in front of us. So our minimum descent height is 690 feet, which we've now just passed. We can see the runway, we can carry on with the approach, and yeah, it's very, very similar to ILS, but obviously there's a little bit more detail involved with regards to the altitude constraints. And if you do have a Navigraph subscription, having the charts in front of you is very, very handy. Let's see if we can make a decent landing out of this.
60, 50, 40, 30, 20. Retard. Slide.
Well, there we are. We're down. So that's basically it. Not much to it, is there? Similar to the ILS, as I say. You're still using navigation, but you're using GPS navigation. So it's still the use of the managed mode. Look for those altitude constraints and how that works. But yeah, that's pretty much it. The only other thing I would mention, and again because it's a simulator, it's not really applicable to the simulated world, but in the real world you can't make an Rnav approach unless you have a very high accuracy of GPS. But there's a lot of information on this page here that is missing compared to the real McDo and the real Airbus, so that's just for extra information. So thanks for watching, guys. Hope you found that little tutorial useful. If you did, please subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. There'll be more tutorials to come, and of course there's the live streams that we do throughout the week as well. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again soon.